Good evening, everybody, and Shalom Aleichem. Tonight is the beginning of Lag BOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, which is a day, as we all know, of significance, but it's also a day which is somewhat shrouded in mystery. And while we all perhaps have certain associations in our mind between different events and symbols as far as what the day of Lag BOmer is all about, when all is said and done, when we try to understand Lag BOmer and identify its unique features, characteristics in history, we're usually left with more questions than answers. But certainly it makes sense to reflect for a moment upon the general theme of the period of Sfiras HaOmer, particularly the period of time in which we observe mourning. And that is based on a Gemara in Yevamos, Tav Samach Beis, where the Gemara tells us that the great Tana Ribakiva had 12,000 pairs of students, meaning there were 12,000 chavrusas, pairs, for a total of 24,000 students who died within a very short period of time. There was some sort of plague which took the lives of many, and frankly speaking, really all of Ribakiva's ordained students in a very, very short period of time. This was obviously a great tragedy, not only for Ribakiva personally, but for the entire world. And as a result, well, the Gemara doesn't say this explicitly, but we observe mourning this time of year as a way of commemorating and remembering this great tragedy. Now, the Meiri on that Gemara tells us that we have a Kabbalah that on the day of Lag BOmer, Pascha Hamisa, the plague came to an end, that the Ribakiva students stopped dying on Lag BOmer, and so therefore, says the Meiri, because of that, we have like a little bit of a Yom Tov. What does it mean, a little bit of a Yom Tov? Well, we wouldn't fast on Lag BOmer. Perhaps we don't say Tachan on Lag BOmer. That's sort of the extent to which the Meiri suggests that we would actually celebrate this day. But this suggestion of the Meiri, sort of setting the stage as to what may be significant about the day of Lag BOmer, raises, I think, a very, very obvious question. The question is articulated by the Brink, but others wonder as well. And just because Ribakiva's students stopped dying, why would we celebrate? After all, that's not really a reason to celebrate. Perhaps Ribakiva was able to breathe a sigh of relief, but certainly if we understand that basically that plague decimated his entire academy of students, so on a certain level that there was no one left. And so therefore, what does it mean that we celebrate a day in which the terrible plague that took the life of many, many, many people came to an end? So I want to share with you a very, very beautiful approach in understanding not just the answer to this question, but also to appreciate perhaps what the day of Lag BOmer is all about. I heard this years ago, and I saw it in the writings of Rabbi Yaakov Hager, formerly of Monsey, and now Rabbi Haber, in Yerushalayim. And Rabbi Haber says as follows: in order to appreciate this, we should just take a step back for a moment and remind ourselves who Ribakiva was. We know that Ribakiva did not really start learning Torah until the age of 40 years old. So until he was 40, he was a shepherd, a person who was basically, as far as Torah learning was concerned, ignorant. He was not someone who had devoted himself to Torah study. He did not hold Torah scholars in general in very high regard. And on one fateful day, as we know, the Talmud tells us that he noticed that which we perhaps would call an unusual natural phenomenon, but it really caught his attention. And that is that he saw that there was a stone that had been penetrated by water over the course, obviously, of many years, decades, perhaps centuries, little drops of water falling perhaps from a high place and hit the rock, and slowly but surely it bore a hole into the rock. And because Ribakiva saw this, for him it was like this incredible moment of awakening. And he said, wow, look at this. If water can have this effect on hard stone, so certainly Torah can have an incredible effect upon an old man like me. Now, that's a very inspiring story, but it's also somewhat unusual. You would have expected perhaps that Ribakiva would have encountered a great waterfall, and seeing the power of a waterfall, the might, and how millions of gallons of water rushing over the side of a cliff at one moment, that perhaps would be a more powerful metaphor as to how Torah can have such an impact upon an individual. But the little drip, drip, drip of water, how did that actually inspire Ribakiva in such a meaningful way? Sort of what was the lesson, the enduring lesson of this rock? So let's fast forward a little bit. As we know, Ribakiva actually did go to study Torah. He began to excel, ultimately began to teach. And over the course of the second half of his life, he became the most sought-after teacher in all of Israel. And as the Gemara we just cited earlier tells us, he attracted over 20,000 students, 24,000 students who all were drawn to Ribakiva, who became essentially links in the chain in the Masorah, all from this one moment, this moment of inspiration, if you will, this one droplet of water. Now, as we know, Ribakiva students died, as I mentioned, during this time of year. So essentially, Ribakiva had to witness the destruction of his life's work. You know, the relationship between a Rebbe and a Talmud is something which is very meaningful, very a very, very special type of relationship. And that he had to personally witness such a tragedy must have been a terrible blow to him personally. These were, after all, his students to whom he had given smicha. Smicha represents the unbroken chain, the Masorah that begins with Moshe Rabbeinu, who was Makabel Torah Misinai, and transmitted from one generation to the next. Now that all of Ribakiva's students died, so Ribakiva realized that the institution of smicha general was in danger. The Romans, who of course were the great enemies of the Jewish people at this time, they also realized the importance of smicha for the continuation of the Jewish tradition. And so therefore they decreed, the Talmud tells us, that anyone who transmits, who gives smicha, who ordains a student, so that person who gives smicha, the person who receives smicha, and the entire town or city in which this smicha is given occurs will be destroyed. So the Romans really, really made it very difficult. Literally, it was a life-threatening experience to have to go ahead and involve oneself in smicha. But of course, this did not deter Ribakiva. Ribakiva, who was defiant in his determination to continue to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu despite the tremendous persecution against the Jews. So he found one student who he thought was deserving of smicha, and that was the great Tana Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. And we have a tradition that Ribakiva gave smicha to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava on the day of Lag BOmer. And it could be that that's, again, part of the significance of this day. Now, the Gemara tells us on that day that Ribakiva gave Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava smicha, he realized that we have to find other students as well and train them. And so therefore he went with 5 of his students down to the southern part of Eretz Yisrael to try to escape capture from the Romans. These students were Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochai, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Nechemia. But the Gemara tells us that before Ribakiva was able to give them smicha, he was captured and eventually martyred by the Romans, as we know the story of the terrible torture and death of Ribakiva. So that leaves Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava as the sole surviving musmach of Ribakiva. So he then takes these 5 students. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Yudalad tells us to a valley between 2 mountains, away from the cities so that no city would be destroyed for having participated in this celebration of smicha. And I'm going to jump to the end of the story, but basically the Gemara describes that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was Moshe Nefesh. He risked his life. He gave up his life essentially to see to it that these 5 students, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Nechemia, would receive smicha. They escaped, and that was essentially the end, the last act of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, who was martyred after the death of his Rebbe, Ribakiva. Now, Ribakiva, at the time that his students died, was 92 years old, according to the Seder Adora. So you have to imagine a 92-year-old man who had just sustained the worst blow that a person can possibly imagine or endure. His entire life's work, his legacy, his academy of 24,000 students, all dying within a short period of time, almost died before he could see any continuation of his tradition. But on that day, when he almost saw it all come to an end, he had the strength, the foresight, the vision, the courage to give smicha to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Now, he could have said, what good will that do? 24,000 students lost. What will that do? And from where did Ribakiva get the strength? From where did he draw the inspiration to go ahead and to give smicha to one student, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? And maybe that was sort of the legacy, the inspiration of the water hitting the rock. Ribakiva reminded himself that sometimes you don't realize, you don't appreciate, but a little drop can make a world of a difference. We don't always get to see the success of our efforts. We don't always get to see the payros, the fruits that grow from the plants that we seed. But if we put in our effort, if we do our part, so hopefully, Be'ezras Hashem, over the course of time, things continue to grow and develop. Now, today we learn Torah, as we know. And the Torah that we learn, the Torah Shabbat Peh, is based on some very, very basic text, Talmudic text, as well as text from the period of the Tanoim. Some of the five, let's say, most basic sets of Torah from the period of the Tanoim are the Mishnah, the Sifra, the Sifrei, the Tosefta, and the Seder Olam. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Pei Vav teaches that unless named otherwise, a Stam Mishnah, an unnamed Mishnah, is attributed to Rebbe Meir. The Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda. The Sifrei is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The Tosefta is Rabbi Nechemya, and Seder Olam is Rabbi Yossi. So you see that on the day of Lag BOmer, because of the heroic perseverance of one man, Ribakiva, we are here to tell the story of not just Lag BOmer, and not just of this great man, but the incredible legacy that he left behind. Torah, the way it exists in the world today, is a reflection of this great, great legacy, the courage of Ribakiva, who was able to look at a situation of total and complete and utter despair, a situation in which anyone in their right mind would have said, forget it, that's it, I give up, I can't go on. Ribakiva looked at this and he said, I remember from the rock, it doesn't make a difference how hard the stone is, it doesn't make a difference how difficult the task may seem, a little bit of water, a drop and another drop and another drop can actually make a difference. And indeed it did. From Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava came the five students who essentially set the stage for the continuation of Torah, the way we know it, the way we have received it, Ad Hayom Hazeh, to this very day. And so therefore, let us be inspired on this day of Lag BOmer to remember that even though it's true, as the Brit Chadash asks, why should we celebrate a day which represents the end of the death, the end of the plague? That's not a reason to celebrate. But if you look inside the Brit Chadash, he says, we're not celebrating the end of the death. We're celebrating the fact that there was a continuation. We're not celebrating the fact that they no longer died. We're celebrating the fact that we see within this day of Lag BOmer the hope for a new beginning, for a future. That is the power of Lag BOmer. We have all, on a very, very different level, experienced over the past year plus a period of darkness and difficulty and challenge. But the day of Lag BOmer is a day which has a message of hope, a message which tells us, stay with it. No matter what we see around us, no matter how difficult and trying the situation may seem, hold on, and you never know. One drop at a time, we could see tremendous, tremendous success and growth going forward in the future. So let us be inspired on this day of Lag BOmer to take a little insight and inspiration from this incredible legacy of Ribakiva and remind ourselves that despite the odds, how bleak and how dark and how difficult things may seem at any point in our life, we have to have hope, we have to march forward, and hopefully see and bring a Yeshua in our lives, one drop at a time. Thank you so much and have a wonderful Shabbos.